Welcome to everyone joining us here today. My name is Shayla Favor, and I serve as the chair of City Council's Housing, Homelessness, and Building Committee, and I'd like to officially call this hearing to order. Today, I am hosting this hearing to share and hear feedback on a proposed relocation code policy in partnership with the Department of Development and Vacancy and Foreclosure Registries, which were part of City Council's housing policy package announced last March. This initiative has been led by Council President Council President Pro Tem Dorrance and his team. Thank you for your hard work on these policies. And finally, we will provide an update on the remainder of City Council's housing initiatives. I'd also like to take this opportunity to recognize another one of our colleagues who have joined the call, our Vice Chair for the Housing, Homelessness, and Building Committee, Councilmember Melissa Green. It's no secret that Columbus and our region is growing. Every day, 40 people move into the city of Columbus. While this growth creates wonderful opportunities for our residents, with it also comes challenges, housing being one of those. Currently, we do not have the housing stock to support this growth. We are alarmingly underbuilding housing units at all price points. Because of this pressurized housing market, we are seeing the devastating effects of higher numbers of resident displacements, the growth of homelessness in our community, and out-of-town investors buying properties and not upholding their duty to ensuring habitable living spaces, like Latitude 525 and Colonial Village. If we fail to keep up with the housing demand, we will continue to see this. This cannot be the story for Columbus. The City of Columbus firmly stands in our belief that every resident in the City of Columbus deserves safe, stable housing without being a cost burden. Housing is a human right, period. This is why we are taking actions. With that, I'd like to jump into our presentations. First, I would like to introduce Deputy Director Hannah Jones with the Department of Development, who will present on the proposed relocation code legislation. Deputy Director Hannah Jones, I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Chair Favor, President Pro Tem, and members of the Council for the opportunity to present to you today. Over the past 2 years, our
Deputy Director, it is a little hard to hear you.
Is that one better?
Yes, much better. Thank you.
My apologies for that. All right. Over the past 2 years, our community has witnessed, and for many residents, lived through two of the worst examples of landlord neglect, as you mentioned, Chair Favor. In December of 2022, on the Near East Side, the residents of Latitude 525 were vacated on Christmas during a snowstorm when pipes burst throughout the property because the landlord left windows open in multiple empty units, leaving 150 households without their belongings or a home to go back to. In the fall of 2023, the city again had to intervene when it was discovered that approximately 1,300 individuals were residing in units that were deemed unsafe for human habitation because those units lacked basic necessities like heat and water. Both of these scenarios made headlines for a multitude of reasons. First, the concern and care of our community to ensure that these neighbors received assistance, attention, and access to a long-term, stable housing option. Second, the efforts of the City of Columbus to hold the property ownership accountable for the conditions they let the tenants live in, the neglect that led to the vacates, and ultimately payment for the costs incurred by the city to assist these families. Our emergency shelter system can currently accommodate approximately 800 persons per night and frequently operates above that capacity. Had the city not intervened to provide hotel rooms in either of these crises, our shelter system would have been quickly overwhelmed, as you mentioned earlier. The city attorney successfully argued in court that in the Latitude 525 case, the owner was responsible for those costs. And he is making the same argument in the case that has been brought against the Colonial Village ownership. And while we believe the city attorney will again be successful, we want to ensure that the City of Columbus is setting a clear expectation of this obligation to all property owners by requesting an addition to the housing code to ensure that taxpayers are not left holding the bill when these types of events happen. Development in partnership with the Department of Building and Zoning Services and the City Attorney's Office has submitted for City Council's consideration an amendment to Title 45, the Housing Code, and Title 7, the Health, Sanitation, and Safety Code, and requested the addition and enactment of a new section, Section 4509.061. This section would require that when a unit is vacated due to an emergency vacate order for issues that the property owner is responsible for, said owner will ultimately be responsible for paying for relocation assistance to the displaced household. This assistance can be provided in one of two ways. If the displacement is temporary due to repairs, all reasonable and necessary temporary housing costs will be covered by the owner. If the unit cannot be reoccupied due to its condition, the owner will provide a cash payment to the household in an amount 3 times the monthly fair market rent as determined by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development according to the household size. If the owner does not provide the assistance, this code will allow the city to provide the assistance and pursue repayment from the owner by any means authorized by the law, if they do not voluntarily reimburse the city within 14 business days. While the Colonial Village and Latitude 525 are high-profile examples of why this code is necessary, there are smaller examples that happen regularly, just a single unit at a time in a larger complex or a single-family rental within our neighborhoods. And for each of these families, the stress of displacement has a destabilizing effect. While moving from your home is always stressful, doing so without notice and into homelessness can be catastrophic and take months, if not years, to recover from. It is our goal to provide assistance and support to help counter that effect and help them regain solid footing. As we continue to face a constrained housing market with limited options for our most vulnerable families, it is imperative that they are able to stay safely housed without facing the exploitation that can occur when there are only a few limited options to keep a roof over people's heads. We have many property owners who are part of the solution and provide assistance to their tenants when situations such as these arise, and we thank them for working in partnership with us. This new code is to help create accountability for those who have yet to join us. In closing, I would like to thank the staff in Building and Zoning Services, as well as the City Attorney's Office for their work on this. And I would also like to recognize 2 of my colleagues, Graham Bowman and Jessica Klinger, for their leadership on this effort. I thank you for your time, and I would be happy to answer any questions you or your colleagues may have.
Thank you, Deputy Director Jones, for the presentation. Before I turn it over to my colleagues, I thought it was fitting for us to ask a few questions, just specifically about the policy itself. But I'm wondering if you could talk about the cost burden that some of these larger abatements and displacements has had on the city. We just had City Council meeting last night and passed, I believe, the 3rd piece of legislation that would provide additional funding to the Community Shelter Board to support the residents who have been displaced by Colonial Village. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So for Colonial Village, we have allocated approximately $6 million for the housing costs alone. In addition to that, City Council has also provided generous support of about $281,000 for the wraparound services that go to help those families. So specifically for Colonial, you have a lot of asylum-seeking families, and they have a lot of additional supports that they need to navigate the legal system. So there's the direct housing support and then the tangential costs as well. In the case of Latitude 525, we did approximately $950,000 in housing support, and then we also did rental assistance as well through ERA. We have done rental assistance for Colonial Village families as well. I believe we've done about $240,000. So you're looking at close to $9 million in assistance. That is directly for those 2. That's outside, of course, the normal assistance we're providing to the shelter board, as well as assistance to all of the social service partners that wrap around these families.
And I thank you for making sure to highlight that this $6 million that has been set aside to support the residents at Colonial Village is on top of other money that has been used to support the folks that are navigating being unhoused in our community. And so when we just think about Colonial Village alone, and by no means is this an indictment on whether or not the city should support our residents. We absolutely should be supporting our residents, especially in times of distress like displacement. But when we think about the constraints on our housing market and how we truly need to be doing everything we can to putting more shovels into the ground, that $6 million could be utilized to put more units in our community. Is that a fair statement?
It is absolutely. I think anytime there is going to be a crisis and we have to ensure that our population is safe, we're going to step in and do that. But we want to be able to leverage that money and put it into a longer term investment. And that's why it is important to create this accountability, to put the obligation on the property owner if they're not willing to do it. And I do want to recognize that we do have owners every single day who we ask them to provide the relocation assistance voluntarily, and they do it. This is really to ensure that where we can mitigate the cost and liability on the city, we can do that so that those resources that we have can be better directed towards a longer term system level intervention.
Thank you for that. Let me turn to my colleagues to see if they have any questions for you. President Pro Tem Dorans, do you have any questions for the department?
Not this time.
Thank you. And Vice Chair Green?
None at this time either. Thank you.
Thank you. Deputy Director, could you talk a little bit about the mechanics of how this relocation code would actually work? And so once a unit would be vacated, would the owner have to go to court? How would that actually work?
Sure. So there's two components. One is how do we assist the tenant? And then the second is the enforcement mechanism with the owner. So with the tenant, we have actually been utilizing part of our ERA funding that we still have available to pilot a relocation assistance program. So oftentimes code enforcement is engaged with a property before you get to the vacate point. So once a code officer knows that they may have to vacate a unit, when they go out to serve that order, they are coming out with a social worker from CPH. The social worker is then assisting the family to access relocation assistance. Right now, we have funding sitting with Compass. Compass is a not-for-profit partner from Broad Street Presbyterian who helps provide either a hotel option or start them in the process of accessing rental assistance. The goal of also having a social worker is if there are any other resource needs that the families have, especially if they have to permanently relocate, they can start to help them triage that and access those services there. So that's how we ensure. That would be also the point where a code officer would be asking a landlord to pay these costs or show proof that they will be providing a hotel option before we have to engage. So that is the tenant side of it. On the landlord side of it, what would happen is code enforcement would issue their standard notice that they have now. We are actually in the process of finalizing some adjustments to that notice to clearly delineate when it is a property owner's obligation that is causing the vacate. So there are tenant issues that can cause a vacate, and then there are issues that are the property owner's responsibility. And oftentimes in an order, both of those are listed because they're both in the same sections of the housing code. So we want to refine the order to make it clear if a vacate is occurring because of something the owner had to do. If they had to do it and they declined to provide relocation services, then that social worker would connect with Compass or whomever may be the organization that we work with to provide the housing assistance as is appropriate. So either temporary assistance until the repair is done or the payment in order to access a new unit. And then if they were going to be in environmental court, our efforts after we had notified them that they owed us money would be tacked on to the environmental court case. Or we are currently talking to the city attorney's office about going through the claims process if it does not in fact have to go to environmental court. So we're still finalizing that piece of it if it is not through environmental court, but most of the time I would imagine that it would be through the environmental court process.
Thank you for that, Deputy Director. When I think specifically about Latitude 525, and I want to take this opportunity to thank the great work from our folks over at the Columbus City Attorney's Office who worked diligently to advocate on behalf of those residents who were impacted by that displacement 2 winters ago. But there was an opportunity to secure some type of financial support for each of those residents that had been impacted. Would this new policy provide some type of recourse, financial recourse for those residents who may have been impacted by a displacement that was an error due to the owner's, an error made by the owner?
I don't know if you want to speak to that one at all, Laura.
Thank you, Deputy Director. Chair Favor, this legislation would not specifically address that issue. We want to make sure that the residents would have the opportunity to have all legal recourses available to them still at their disposal. Certainly, as the city attorneys did in the examples that you've provided, we would seek to recover as much as we could through our litigation for the tenants as part of the resolution of any case. But this particular program does not create a separate private right of action.
Thank you
And
for
the
that.
last thing, sorry, council member, the last thing I would add to Laura is that was one of the key roles that legal aid played in that case, was really taking on the advocacy on behalf of the tenants for the loss of their belongings and their access to additional damages. So of course, in all of this work, it is critical that we have our community partners at the table to be able to do some of that work too.
Thank you. And we've thrown out Latitude 525 and Colonial Village. How frequent do these displacements happen in our community?
So when we started doing the pilot, we asked BZS to run the number of vacates that they do annually outside of large scale, and it's about 40. So I think that in principle, our goal would be to utilize this code and process when a large scale vacate occurs. But really, I see it as a safety net for those smaller scale ones that happen. And honestly, kind of to help code when they are kind of navigating, and the city attorney's office and all the folks who work on nuisance abatement properties, how to keep the landlord on the right track to make improvements, but also provide resources for tenants. So another example that we have utilized the pilot for would be South Park. They have had a number of sewer related issues that have taken units offline. And that is an example where the landlord has been willing to pay the relocation cost for those tenants. So it is a unit at a time. It's not an entire building. It's not the entire complex, but it would be a property that's on everybody's radar of concern, which is why having a code like this, if South Park were to go a different direction, is important. But it's also a way for us to keep that property owner at the table and say, look, you're showing us a good faith effort to continue to provide solutions for your residents. But we still have the social workers going out with the code officers when they do those visits. So there have been about 3 units, I believe, so far that we've engaged with, and provide other interventions if the families need it while they are off-site, while their unit's being repaired.
Thank you. And last question. While we have talked a lot about Columbus's growing housing crisis, we know that housing insecurity disproportionately impacts our seniors, our disabled residents, low-income residents, and our immigrant, migrant, and refugee communities differently. Thinking about the advocacy that has been centered around the issues that have transpired at Sandridge and Riverview, would this policy have helped those residents?
This policy directly would not have, because it is about specifically nuisance issues that are caused by the property owner's responsibility. For Sandridge and Riverview, that was really about month-to-month leases and or a desire to increase the rent and the inability of the tenants to pay for it. What I would say, though, is in all of this work, identifying different interventions to meet those populations who are most vulnerable that you were speaking of, council member, at different points is equally important. So there is a lot of crossover. We have our housing resource specialists who we were able to engage to go out and help those families navigate the space. They're all part of the Central Ohio Stable Housing Network. So there's a lot of shared information, networking, and ability to provide other interventions. But this legislation specifically would not necessarily have been able to prevent those two situations.
Thank you. I think it was important to make sure that we discuss that distinction, that while we have been talking about large complexes, that apartment complexes that have had displacement, there's displacement that can occur for many different reasons in our community. And in this instance, we're talking specifically about emergency vacate situations that would necessitate the city coming in to support residents that may need to find housing in untraditional ways.
Yes.
Wonderful. My colleagues have any questions at this time? If not, we will move forward. Thank you, Deputy Director Jones. Next, we will hear from Council President Pro Tem Rob Dorrance, who will present on the proposed vacancy and foreclosure registry. President Pro Tem, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Councilmember Favor, and just want to say thank you to you and certainly the members of the administration that are here today. We know there's not one individual solution to the housing crisis that Columbus is experiencing right now, which is why there's been a number of housing initiatives that have been led by the housing chair and individual members of council over a number of years. Two pieces of legislation that I've had the opportunity to work on over the past year have been the Vacant and Foreclosure Registry legislation that now will be coming before council in the coming weeks. The purpose of these two registries are to help to identify properties in our community that one are vacant or in an impending foreclosure. And there's a couple of reasons for us to make sure that the city is aware of the properties that are in those conditions. Is one, many properties that are vacant, we know are magnets for blight in our community. So ensuring that our code team is being proactive and not reactive in understanding which of those properties in our community need the scrutiny to make sure that they're complying with our housing code. And two, properties that are currently going through the foreclosure process, don't have an active individual residing at that location often, which often can lead to the same types of outcomes in which that property needs additional scrutiny as it relates to our code team. Second, in a time in which we are facing a housing crisis in Columbus, in which we need desperately more housing units, it's confounding to know that we have thousands of potential properties in our community that currently are not in a condition to allow folks in our community to call those units home. So for us, it's very important for us to, one, know where these units are, and how do we ensure that we're working towards making these properties productive in our community. Again, when I say productive, I mean by that the ability for folks to rent or own those properties to make sure that at a time in which housing is incredibly needed across our community, that those housing units are brought back online. So with that, I want to go into a PowerPoint presentation to sort of give a little bit of an overview of the two pieces of legislation as they currently stand. These have went through a number of different revisions over the last year, and we're confident that we're in the position now to bring these formally before council. So with that, I'm going to make sure that hopefully this works, and hopefully folks at this point are seeing my screen. So first, we'll talk about the vacancy registration legislation. This establishes the registry for vacant properties in Columbus. And the first question folks may ask is, well, what do you mean by vacant? Simply because I'm not at my house today, does that make it vacant? Well, no. How we're defining this as a building or a dwelling unit that is not being occupied as a home, a residence, a sleeping place, or under lease during that period. So it's really trying to identify properties that currently do not have anyone living in them. There's no attempt to be renting them out as a rental within our community, to, again, identify housing units in Columbus that could otherwise be productive and otherwise needs potentially extra scrutiny from our code team. At the time of the initial registration, property owner can also submit and request relief from the registration fee from our Property Maintenance and Appeal Board, which is worked through for the Department of Building and Zoning Services. A property owner can be exempt from the fee that they would pay at the time of registration if they can demonstrate a financial hardship, And certainly that appeals board may waive that registration requirement if that hardship does exist. Again, the legislation works to ensure that owners of vacant properties are known to the city, and this is really important, can be reached. Oftentimes when we see a property that is in foreclosure or is vacant, one of the key issues is that oftentimes those properties have moved between owners, whether or not an owner has passed or other situations. Oftentimes it's very, very difficult for us to determine who actually is the owner of that property. Maybe to, again, make them aware of code violations to bring them back in compliance with those, and ensure that the city has someone to work with, sort of moving forward with these kinds of things. The legislation is currently scheduled for a first read, which was last night, and we are expecting to bring it for a formal vote before council on the 15th. Try to hold on 1 second as we. There we go. Now it's across the screen. Sorry about that, everyone. There are some exemptions that we have built into this legislation, and that is primarily around trying to, again, do a better job of better defining what actually constitutes a vacant dwelling. And a couple of those exemptions that are clearly outlined within the legislation are vacant buildings that are subject of insurance claim that renders the building uninhabitable. Makes sense if someone had, say, significant roof damage from a storm and they're not able to live there, but it's, currently waiting for that insurance claim to be able to have folks come fix the property. That wouldn't fall within, this registry. If, a building is vacant, but the property owner is actively seeking to lease that building, that wouldn't fall within this registry. Vacant buildings that have a valid permit issued from the city for a short-term rental would not fall within this. And certainly vacant buildings that have an active building permit. So if someone's doing the work to fix up a property, even though it's not rented, there's no need for them to register. Also, vacant buildings that are owned by our local, regional, or state land bank would be exempted. And accessory dwelling units, or better known as ADUs, would not fall within this registry. Moving on to the foreclosure registry. This would establish a registration program as a mechanism to help protect neighborhoods from becoming blighted because lack of maintenance and other properties that are in foreclosure status. As I mentioned earlier, oftentimes when a property is going through a foreclosure, that means that there may not be someone actively living on the property, which again can unfortunately contribute to blight if in fact those properties are not kept up by the property owner, whether or not that's the current property owner or whether or not that's a financial institution that's taken ownership of the property during that foreclosure process with the Court of Common Pleas here in Franklin County. Again, this registry was on first read last night at City Council on July 1st with an expected passage date on July 15th at our next council meeting. With that, I want to pause and see if council members or staff have any questions about these two registries at this point.
Thank you, Councilmember Dorans. I do have just a few questions. When, let's say the policy, passes this month, are we looking to, when would the effective date be? When would folks need to begin to comply?
Yeah, we will have some additional compliance time for folks built into this, and we're going to be working with the Department of Building, Zoning, and Services on identifying sort of that precise date. This will not be passed as emergency, so there'll be additional time to bring folks into compliance. There's also a number of different sort of bureaucratic mechanisms that exist within the city right now. So there are folks that are pulling permits. There's also some things that the Department of Building, Zoning, and Services does with folks that have an active vacant property right now, in which we're going to be working with them to make sure that folks are notified of this throughout the process. But this is not intended to be past emergency, so we'll have sort of a standard 30 days at minimum implementation. And then really we'll be working with the Department of Building, Zoning, and Services to identify how to implement these. We've discussed this with Director Messer of the Department of Building, Zoning, and Services. There's some additional rulemaking that the department plans to undertake in order to, at minimum, to set the fees, so what folks will have to pay to to get on the registries, but also some of those internal processes to make sure that these two registries function well on a day-to-day basis and don't needlessly create too much bureaucracy for folks to be able to navigate.
And then assuming that most folks won't go to Title 45 to find the definition of what is designated as a vacant property, what about properties that are for sale or somebody has just moved out? Will those property owners be forced to comply with this registry?
They will not. So if a property is one actively being marketed either for sale or for a lease, those properties would be exempted under the vacant portion of the vacant registry as it currently is defined. As I said at sort of the outset of my comments, it's a really difficult thing once you start digging down to what we actually want to identify when we use the term vacant. And it really is properties that are long-term, no one's living in, not being actively tried to transfer. These are really properties in our community that, as we sort of dug into this process with our colleagues in the Department of Building and Zoning Services, oftentimes these are properties that have transferred, when someone has passed, or transferred when, a business has sort of gone away. And really, you have not seen any meaningful investment in these properties, oftentimes for months, if not years. So, one of the questions we've heard consistently from folks when we've talked about this is that, hey, if there's a 30 days between I have new tenants moving in, is that going to require? No. This is really trying to target those properties that are vacant, are consistently vacant. No one is undertaking any activities either to invest and improve these properties, or they've just, pretty much sat in a manner that, again, is both contributing to potentially the neighborhood blight within that neighborhood, but also at the same time, not there's no disincentive for folks oftentimes to just sit on a property for years at a time. One of the cruel realities of our housing crisis is that while we don't have enough housing, because of the imbalance in supply and demand, that means that property values have significantly risen for residents in our community for a long time, meaning that, it's oftentimes advantageous for folks potentially just to sit on property for a very long time while just waiting until it gets valuable enough to sell. That's the kind of thing that, again, when a city has the kind of housing crisis we have, that's not the kind of behavior that we want to, incentivize within our community. So certainly we're looking to try and work with folks, one, to identify these properties, but work with them to try and bring them back online in a way that provides more housing for our families in Columbus.
Thank you. And this might be a question for the departments, but I know at one point we had an overabundance of vacant properties in the city, probably close to 8,000 or so. And I believe that number has been cut in half. But how big of a problem is this for us? Do we have an idea of our vacant count right now or our foreclosure count?
Yeah, so and certainly I would defer to Mr. Celebrezzi from the Department of Building and Zoning Services, but in our conversations with the department, right now there's no requirement that our code team is specifically identifying properties as vacant as it would be defined by these pieces of legislation, but a little bit of the back of the envelope math based upon a number of different factors that that department considers. We're probably looking at right now likely somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 properties likely falling within this definition. We'll certainly know more as the registry gets stood up. Regarding foreclosures, I don't have an accurate number on that, but it's a little bit easier it is easier to track because foreclosure is what we would define as sort of a legal term of art that's defined by the Ohio Revised Code. And the foreclosure process, as you know, Chair Favor, but for other folks that may not know, is a legal process that goes through the Court of Common Pleas. So, one of the reasons we spend a lot of time trying to define what vacant means for purposes of this registry is that there's not a clear definition from another place for us to use, which is why we've tried to be very, very thoughtful about not trying to swoop in, things that wouldn't really make a lot of sense to have on that registry for our goals for it. But from a foreclosure standpoint, it's a lot easier for us to be able to track how many will fall into that registry, simply because, again, there's a legal process that is taking place within the Common Pleas Court for us to be able to identify. identify. And certainly we're going to be working with the Department of Building and Zoning Services on ways in which they can work with the Common Police Court in order to have a system in place in which they're able to track that on a very effective basis, because there is a triggering event, there is a legal case for them to be able to identify that.
Thank you. That's all for me, President Pro Tem.
Thank you, Chair. Councilmember Green or anyone else?
Nothing for me at this time. Thank you.
Right. Well, again, thank you, Chair Favor. I'll turn it back over to you, but I appreciate the opportunity to work with you and your staff on these two pieces of legislation, and excited to be able to bring them to council when we meet next.
Thank you, President Pro Tem Dorans, and to your team who has been extremely engaged in this process. As you indicated, it has gone through a couple of different revisions over the last few years, but you guys have hung in there, and so I'm gratefully appreciative of that work. As a reminder, in March of 2023, Council announced a robust housing policy package to help create new units, preserving existing units, and strengthening housing rights. As of July 2023, we passed six of the policies, which included retaliatory action, home ownership opportunities, which providing targeted down payment assistance and housing counseling services for first-time home buyers, third-party payment and pay to stay, which allows a tenant an affirmative defense to an eviction action filed on the basis of non-payment of rent, owner-occupied initiative, which provides home repair solutions for senior population, and legal representation at eviction court, ensuring that all residents have an opportunity for legal representation. The vacancy and foreclosure registries would bring that to 7 policies if they are passed before break. If you have any specific questions on these initiatives, please visit www.housingforallcbus.com, and the contact information for each office is listed, or you can reach out to my legislative aide, Cindy DiGindo, at snjindal@columbus.com. Next, we will focus on the remaining initiatives from Council's housing package, and each council member or council office will provide you with an update. Followed by that, we will hear from our public speaker for today. Rent increase notification. I will begin by sharing an update on rent increase notification, which is being led by my office. This legislation would require that any rental agreement or renewal for a rental unit must require at least 180-day notice when the monthly rental price will be increasing upon renewal. Currently, in the Ohio Revised Code, under a month-to-month rental agreement, the landlord must give a full 30 days notice before increasing rent. This is what we saw most recently at properties like Riverview and Sandridge. In the case of a lease, more standard 12 or perhaps an 18-month lease. Landlords may not raise rents during the term of the lease agreement, but they could technically tell the residents 30 or 15 days before the date of the lease ending that they are raising prices. This notification is critical in allowing tenants who cannot afford the increased rent price more time to find a suitable replacement or access funds to stay in that unit. At this time, we are beginning stakeholder engagement and working to draft legislation. We understand that this legislation has many differing opinions, and we do not want to rush this process. We will be intentional in outreach and hearing from all community members before creating legislation. We hope to have a piece of legislation that will be passed in Q4 this year. With that being said, we are open to feedback at any time. And so if you have any feedback, please reach out to my legislative aide, once again, Cindy DiGindo at snjindal@columbus.gov. I will now share an update on the rental registry initiative that is being led by Councilmember Bankston, who could not be here with us today. Councilmember Bankston remains committed to continuing to pursue and consider the implementation of a rental registry. At this point in time, his office is in active conversations with the Columbus City Attorney's Office to understand how current case law, state law, and other variables affect the establishment of a city-run rental registry, given the fact that there is a rental registry with the Franklin County. Establishment of a rental registry has many positives. However, there are several complexities and potential unintended impacts that must be worked through before moving forward. He would like to thank everyone who has provided thoughts regarding a potential registry to date and encourages the community to continue communicating with his office regarding any comments or concerns that they may have about a potential registry. Comments can be sent to his legislative aide, JP Dorval, at jpdorval@columbus.gov. To date, no legislation has been drafted, nor has an official proposal been shared. His goal is to have an update on this policy by the end of this calendar year and looks forward to continued engagement on this topic. Finally, we will hear an update from Councilmember Emmanuel Remy, from his legislative aide, Avery Townsend, on the accessory dwelling unit pilot initiative.
Thank you, Councilmember Favor. Our office has been working with your office over the past year to develop an ADU accessory dwelling unit pilot program. We believe the creation of accessory dwelling units, ADUs, have a real place in the larger discussion of the housing crisis. These small, self-contained units built on the same property as an existing home provide affordable housing options without requiring new land development. An accessory dwelling unit is a secondary housing unit located on the same property as a single-family home. Often referred to as in-law suites or carriage houses, ADUs can take various forms. For the purpose of this pilot, we are specifically referring to detached ADUs, which are separate structures such as a small house in the backyard. ADUs are fully functional living spaces with their own kitchen, bathroom, and living areas. They can help alleviate housing shortages, increase urban density, and offer flexible living arrangements for extended family members or rental income for homeowners. ADUs also contribute to sustainable living by utilizing existing infrastructure and promoting more efficient land use. Overall, ADUs present a versatile and practical approach to expanding housing opportunities in communities. This pilot program will provide a financial incentive for the construction of ADUs for Columbus residents that are accepted into the initial pilot. Pilot units will also be required to be enrolled in the city's Community Reinvestment Area program and therefore subjected to the CRA's affordability covenant, which is a maximum of 120% AMI for area median income for a period of 15 years. ADUs are required to be on owner-occupied land and cannot be used for short-term rentals. With our partners at Jonathan Barnes Architecture and Design, we've also nearly completed an ADU manual that will be accessible to any resident interested in building an ADU in the city of Columbus. The manual will be a step-by-step guide on the process of building an ADU, and we're so excited to share this resource with our residents. It's something that we've been asked for many times, and we're excited to launch that. While the fine print of the official pilot program is still being actively worked on by our teams and partners, we're optimistic that we'll be able to launch an application potentially early this fall. So this program is not live, but we will be sure to let anyone know when it is. And this program is quite cutting edge in the housing space and therefore has required more advanced planning and implementation. We're aware that this program is something that many residents have a lot of interest in, and we're excited to bring it to the community as soon as we can. And then, as always, if you have any questions, you can email me. I'm Councilmember Remy's legislative aide, Avery Townsend, at ajtownsend, AJTOWNSEND, @columbus.gov. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Townsend, for that update on our ADU pilot program. You're absolutely correct. We are very excited to kick this one off the ground, knowing that residents in Columbus are looking for all types of housing solutions. And so we do have to stretch ourselves beyond just single family development as well as multifamily. So very excited for this program in Columbus. Next, I'll introduce John Tanu, Senior Policy Advisor in Council President Hardin's office, to provide an update on the Wholesale Regulation policy.
Thank you, Chair Favor, for your leadership on this work and other council members. I'm here to chat about the work that Council President Hardin's team has been doing on wholesaler regulation. First, just a little bit of context for how we came to this work. Since last year, we have been trying to understand the growing share of properties in our communities that are not purchased by working families and first-time home buyers, but by bulk buyers, institutional investors, and high-volume landlords. Data is hard to come by, but according to the county auditor, we think about 1 in 5 of our properties in this county are going to folks who already own hundreds of units. And to be clear, a lot of that investing is perfectly legitimate. But what we know on the ground is that there are a lot of predatory investors going into distressed neighborhoods, maybe targeting folks who specifically owe a lot on their taxes, especially now that property taxes have gone up. They often misrepresent themselves as realtors or brokers. They send those harassing, can I buy your house for cash text messages or flyers, and they make a lowball cash offer. A lot of this behavior is what we call wholesaling, as opposed to the kind of standard regulated practice of real estate by a license holder. What wholesalers do is they get a seller's home under contract, then they find an interested investor to buy it. They assign their rights in the contract to the buyer at a higher price than they bought it for, and then they pocket the difference. So they're essentially the middlemen who match buyers with sellers, but they don't follow any of the protections of regulated real estate. They also avoid paying the transfer fee in this process. We're really fixated on this because we know that wholesaling is a critical link in the chain that delivers a lot of our properties into the hands of out-of-state buyers, where these properties often become hotbeds for code enforcement. They are the ones that you often hear about from residents that are deteriorating their neighborhoods. And these wholesalers hide their tracks. They take advantage of a lot of loopholes to use a range of LLCs. So it's hard to follow these parcels as they're often moved dozens at a time. So last year, we held 2 hearings in partnership with Chair Faber and the Housing Committee to seek feedback on what we should do about this. And since then, we've been engaging with experts and stakeholders. There have been 2 things about this that are pretty challenging that I just want to highlight. First, it's been difficult to figure out at times legally as a city, what are our rights here? We know that regulating the practice of real estate falls under the state's authority, not the city's. And so we've been trying to discern where those guardrails are. We've also been trying to figure out what's enforceable and how any rules that we follow would actually be, violated. If they're violated, how would we know that and how would we follow up? Because so many of the folks who violate them aren't physically here. And these are pretty tricky, which is why most cities across the United States have not taken on wholesaling. Where we have landed is the proposal of a wholesaler registry. So those folks who want to wholesale properties would have to identify themselves, they'd have to register themselves in their transactions, and they'd have to agree to follow certain practices. So for example, we might require properties that are transferred via wholesaling to have what's called a local agent in charge, essentially making sure that the person who's responsible for it actually lives here in Franklin County or lives in a surrounding county. We might also ask those registered wholesalers to disclose the LLCs they work out of. The idea is that if wholesalers don't register or don't follow these practices, they could incur penalties. The other thing I want to say is we've met plenty of good wholesalers. There are some appropriate reasons why someone might choose this route. And so we've tried to think about practices that aren't burdensome to those folks out there who aren't part of the problem, that they'd be easily able to follow. We're also proposing some mandatory disclosure rules. So when properties are transferred via wholesaling, residents would be given information like how to identify fair market value. They'd be told up front, the person that is purporting to represent your sale does not have fiduciary duty to you. They'd have to disclose their registration number and if they even actually own that property, because that would help you figure out if they're a registered wholesaler or if they even actually can complete the transaction they're purporting to engage in. We're also trying to figure out how to restrain the abusive volume and misleading nature of marketing that accompanies these efforts. Again, this is tough because plenty of realtors are legitimate and they do a lot of marketing. So we're trying to figure out how to distinguish what's proper from what's not. Finally, even apart from any sort of legislative changes, we are devising a big education effort because we know that at the end of the day, homeowners need to understand what wholesaling is, why it's not their only option, how they can negotiate a good deal, what are red flags in real estate transactions that should give them pause, and what should they do if they do experience bad wholesaling. So that's where we are. Right now, we are reviewing draft legislative language. We hope to soon start to show it to stakeholders and experts to get their feedback. I think it's likely that we would not advance legislation before the fall, but it remains our goal to move on these abusive practices that we see playing out in our neighborhoods at some point this autumn. So happy to pause and take any questions or comments from folks.
Thank you, Mr. Tanous, and I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge another one of our colleagues who has joined the call, Council Member Nancy Day Alcauer, who has joined as well. Thank you for your presence today. And thank you to Council President Shannon Hardin's office for their steadfast work on working through this tricky world of wholesaling. But we know that part of addressing our housing crisis is also making sure that we are tackling these predatory behaviors that are occurring every single day in our community. But this one is a tricky one. And so your office has done its due diligence to understand the world of wholesaling and what we as the city can do to make a difference in this area. So thank you for that. If there are no further questions from my colleagues, I'm going to open it up for public testimony. And we do have one public speaker that is joining us virtually today, Mr. Derek Bergman. If you can please state your name, even though I have stated, and if you represent any organization, and I believe you will have 3 minutes to provide your testimony. Mr. Bergman? Let's check with council staff. Is Mr. Bergman on?
Councilmember, he is not.
Okay. Please let the record reflect that we did provide an opportunity for Mr. Bergman, and we'll reach out to him to obtain that testimony. Thank you to my colleagues, Council President Pro Tem Dorans, as well as Council Member Vice Chair Green and Council Member Nancy Day Alcauer for your presence today, as well as to Council Member Bankston and Council Member Remy for sharing their updates, and Council President Hardin's office for sharing their updates on the policies that they're working on. And a thank you to Director Stevens and Deputy Director Jones for their work on the relocation code, as well as our community members here with us today. I want to ensure all of our residents here and are listening, who are listening online, that we do not take housing and our region's housing crisis lightly. As I've said many times before, we cannot fix this housing crisis with one policy. We need to be intentional about making changes to our zoning, protecting the affordability we have, and being creative about adding more housing stock in our city. Additionally, it is important to acknowledge the reality of systemic racism, the complex interaction of policies, procedures, laws, and institutions that have created disparities in housing. The reality is that housing insecurity is not evenly distributed across the population. And so whether we're talking about evictions, homelessness, or poverty, housing insecurity disproportionately affects people of color, older adults, the disabled, and low-income wage earners. We need to take a holistic, comprehensive approach to understand the needs of our community to properly address the housing crisis. I invite you all to continue to stay engaged with council offices and with the Department of Development to share your ideas and to stay updated on the initiatives you have heard here today. I'd also like to take a moment to remind everyone about housingforallcbus.com, where you can find information on these initiatives as well as others, and rentful614.com, which serves as the rental assistance hub for tenants and landlords. Our next hearing will be an in-person hearing next Wednesday, July 10th at 5 p.m. in council chambers. If you would like to provide written or sign up to provide 3-minute testimony during the hearing, please email my legislative analyst, Kendra Asaidu, at knasiedu@columbus.gov with the subject line July 10th hearing testimony with your name and address by noon on July 10th. To get a copy of the legislation, you can reach out to my legislative aide, Sanjeev Tindall, at snjindal@columbus.gov. Finally, I'd like to thank my staff, as well as Nia Walters with the Legislative Research Office, as well as our team here at City Hall for helping us with our technology and streaming, specifically Mark Carter, as well as the team at CTV. Thank you, and this will now conclude our hearing. Have a wonderful afternoon.